Godzilla 2 War of the Monsters for the NES has been called boring, tedious, and overly difficult, with bland graphics and annoying music. Except for the last point, these critiques are all wrong, and War of the Monsters' bad rap is undeserved. Though it was released in 1992, Godzilla 2 feels fresh even in 2025. Most turn-based tactics games have you facing off against similarly powered armies. Even in the more asymmetric entries, the typical strategy requires you carefully preserve your own units while whittling down the opponents. In Godzilla 2, the player controls the Japanese defense force against a smaller group of much stronger kaiju. JDF attacks are often ineffective, and most units drop like flies against the overpowered enemies. Like the Godzilla movies, battles are desperate, near hopeless struggles for the pitiful humans. This makes the elation and accomplishment all the sweeter when you finally kill Rodan, you irradiated pile of pteranodon garbage! Godzilla 2 is divided into 12 stages, each giving you a set number of troops. To win, you need to be strategic about where, when, how, and with which units to attack. You can't be precious about any of your units, nor can you expect a kaiju to go down from a single salvo. Other elements complicate the strategy. You use a radar car to find and recruit Mothra, and your strongest unit must be built by delivering parts from one base to another. While imperfect, Godzilla 2 delivers in its 12 stages. Some older games, while excellent in some ways, aren't as fun to revisit in the modern age. This can happen when the gameplay has been reiterated and refined so often that playing the precursors can feel like a stale version of something you've experienced a dozen times already. Sometimes nostalgia or love for the story or unique and quirky elements can keep the game fun, but the gameplay elements feel lacking. For the most part, Godzilla 2 is totally unique as a tactics strategy game. Despite its drawbacks, and I'll get to those, it's a good time, an easy recommendation for fans of tactics games or the Godzilla franchise. So why is this game so hated? I think the answer to this question illustrates an important point about video games, and art more generally. Our expectations and mindset have a lot of power to shape our experiences. Some games you may love as a kid and hate as an adult, and vice versa. A game that is typically a blast is tedious in the wrong mood. How you play a game can determine if you have any fun at all. Negative comments about Godzilla 2 that proliferate online often refer to a 2011 review by the Angry Video Game Nerd, either repeating his points or quoting the review directly. I suspect many of these people have not played the game or only played it as children. But no shade on the Angry Video Game Nerd or his review, which is well thought out and quite funny.
I mean, sometimes you gotta take a nasty shit before you can take a better shit.
It's not his fault that people take his comedy reviews too seriously. In his Godzilla video, the Angry Video Game Nerd talks about experiencing Godzilla 2 as a child, and I bet his disappointment was not unique for the title at the time. These days, a Godzilla 2 cartridge goes for around $150, indicating that not many copies were manufactured. I suspect that it did not do well upon release.
As a kid, two of my favorite things were video games and Japanese monster movies. Godzilla, Mothra, Rodan, Ghidorah, Mechagodzilla. Monsters beating the hell out of each other and blowing the fuck out of everything in sight. I love that shit.
Glorious kaiju mayhem is certainly one of the appeals of the Godzilla franchise, and probably the most prominent for children, who aren't likely to notice or care about the film's deeper themes. I think Godzilla movies are at their best when exploring the potential of human collaboration, both for good and ill. In the first Godzilla film, Godzilla is awakened by nuclear weapons and only defeated by something even more devastating and potentially more dangerous to humanity. The inventor of this superweapon, the Oxygen Destroyer featured in Scenario 1, kills himself in its deployment to ensure that it's never used again. Throughout the franchise, Godzilla as a natural disaster is met with profound acts of human collaboration, bravery, and sacrifice, as is typically seen with the mutual aid efforts that always manifest after real-life devastation. In Godzilla 2, the monsters have high defense and regenerate each turn. The best way to take them down is to attack with many units at once, retreating damaged units and replacing them with reinforcements. The only way to fell a kaiju is through teamwork, lining up tanks and planes as they do in the movies. It would have been reasonable to expect War of the Monsters to be an action game where you play as Godzilla, considering it's a direct sequel to an action game where you play as Godzilla. There really was no good reason to call this Godzilla 2. Could have just took out the 2. Godzilla, War of the Monsters. In contrast with an action beat-em-up, Godzilla 2 is a slow-paced strategy sim that requires you read the manual to know what's going on and have any chance at victory. The manual explains the gameplay and provides hints about some of the monster's strengths and weaknesses. It's a patient game for puzzle solvers.
My wish was just to have a traditional tournament fighter featuring all the Godzilla monsters.
Going into War of the Monsters with these expectations, you're gonna have a bad time. Childhood memories and the angry video game nerd review have tainted the delicious wellspring that is this game, and that's a shame. Upon scrutiny, many of the critiques leveled against Godzilla 2 don't hold up, such as the hate for the slot mechanic. Before each fight, a slot machine selects 3 symbols which buff either your unit or the kaiju in various ways, which are described in the manual. This mechanic is necessary to prevent encounters from becoming repetitive. Almost every game needs some luck elements for this reason. This doesn't make victory totally random, as the impact of luck tends to balance out over an entire mission. It is possible to lose key units in a turn due to poor rolls, but for the most part, you can win consistently if you're strategic and give yourself the best odds overall. The slots add tension and create exciting moments in the gameplay. They can also lead to frustrating devastation, but frustrating devastation is a theme of the franchise. Some complain that War of the Monsters is too hard. Your units are weak and attacks often miss. Again, these are themes of the franchise. It wouldn't feel like Godzilla if defeating Godzilla were simple. Human weapons are supposed to be weak against kaiju. It's only through grit and coordination that these monsters can be destroyed. It shouldn't feel easy, it should feel desperate. Even with this, Godzilla 2 is not that difficult. I think that XCOM Enemy Unknown is a far more challenging strategy game. Godzilla 2 is only overly difficult if you don't take the time to learn how to play it. Most units have at least 2 weapons options. The attacks that deal more damage have a lower hit rate. For kaiju with high evasion, Rodan, you need to select your highest hit rate attacks. The common critique that is fair concerns the music. It's not that bad, except that there is only 1 track for your turn and 1 track during the kaiju turn. The soundtrack becomes repetitive and irritating even before the first scenario is over. By 1992, there were so many excellent Godzilla tracks from the movies that it's kind of inexcusable not to translate at least a few of these into 8-bit for this game. I turned off the game volume and put on the soundtrack for Godzilla -1 instead, which is what I'd recommend for anyone playing this game today. There are other legitimate critiques to make against Godzilla 2. While I find it unique, fun, and that it excellently captures certain elements of the movies, it's also underbaked. As it stands, Godzilla 2 is worth playing for tactics and Godzilla nerds, but it could have been a standout classic if given more time and energy. There should be more songs, more units, more kaiju, more animations, and more eye patches. I also would have liked to see the inclusion of story elements, or at least some fun character dialogue. Godzilla 2 was developed and published in-house by Toho, but I found little information about it beyond that, not even the name of a single programmer. There is no credit screen when you beat the final scenario, and no staff listed in the manual. The game was released only in the US, and I can't help but suspect it was developed by a few people on a rushed schedule. Daikaiju Daburis was released by Data East 2 years before Godzilla 2 and for the same system. This game is fully cooked. Tons of units, a funny storyline, detailed battle animations, and a scientist with an eye patch as the good Lord Ishiro Honda intended. This kaiju tactics game never saw an official US release, but there is an English fan translation you can play these days. Daikaiju Daburis plays quite differently than Godzilla 2. You can't kill the kaiju, you instead impede and route its movement while guiding a specific unit to its goal. Though very different in gameplay, it's not hard to compare this to Godzilla 2 and dream about what could have been. Since playing War of the Monsters, I've found 3 other kaiju defense strategy games besides Daikaiju Daburis. 2 of these were released only in Japan in 1995. Gojira Reto Shinkan for the Sega Saturn, and Gojira Kaiju Dai Shingeki for the Game Gear. The latter has an English fan translation, but I've yet to play either. More recently, a game called Kaiju Wars was released for the PC and Nintendo Switch. Kaiju Wars is more similar to Daikaiju Daburis than Godzilla 2, and I suspect much more influenced by the former. Even assuming that Reto Shinkan and Kaiju Dai Shingeki were true sequels to War of the Monsters, building on and fleshing out the gameplay mechanics, these are still games from 1995, with nothing since taking up the mantle of this series. Godzilla 2 War of the Monsters offers unique tactics gameplay that lends itself well to the themes of the franchise, and I think it deserves some newfound love.